said it's again. The 94 dead are a reminder of mob behaviour.
Measures to prevent violence and keep opposing fans apart have made British stadiums resemble prisoner of war camps.
The Americans, at least in this report, blamed the facilities, not the fans. But it seems even in tragedy, Britain, and perhaps Merseyside in particular, is judged more on reputation than hard fact.
The grief and the garlands still abound in Anfield as fans and families pay their respects to the Liverpool dead. Ordinary people drawn here in sorrow. But as Anfield's gates close tonight,
well, I'm sorry, mate, you can't let anyone in.
Another emotion, anger, about the comments of Jacques Georges.
I think he's ignorant and evil, and if he had any humanity about him at all, he'd quit the job and go and hang his head in shame somewhere. What he said is scandalous, and words almost fail me.
There's anger too amid the grief of those who've telephoned helplines.
People are angry at what has happened to their relatives. There's also anger about the whole management of the day.
One Liverpool boy who survived Hillsborough hasn't uttered a word since. Trauma for him while the bereaved try to mourn. As well as counselling, there's practical help on the way as the Hillsborough Disaster Appeal should ease any financial worries among the bereaved. It's already topped £1 million. Tonight, the people of Liverpool who lost their loved ones in a public disaster are trying to cope with their private grief. Everyone here is rallying round to help them. Simon Cole, News at 10 in Liverpool.
The police say they will approach the task of an inquiry into the tragedy with an open mind. The investigation will concentrate on why South Yorkshire Police opened the gate at the back of the ground. Mr. Geoffrey Deere, Chief Constable of the West Midlands Force, who's overseeing the inquiry, said there had already been too much speculation based on emotion.
Tens of thousands of football fans descended on Hillsborough Stadium from all directions. They came by train and road, most arriving well before the 3 o'clock kick-off. Dozens of coaches drove to the city from Liverpool, carrying celebrating fans of all ages.
But we did have some very young ones on board, some very young girls as well, all in the family atmosphere.
Police knew precisely where they wanted the fans to park. When Forest fans arrived in Sheffield, they parked their cars around Rutland Road. Coaches put down in nearby Herries Road, and rail passengers made their way from the mainline station. Some of the last Liverpool fans coming by train arrived at Wardsley Bridge Station close to the ground. Those in coaches were set down off Halifax Road, and those driving parked at Parson Cross. The last train arrived at Wardsley Bridge Station, which is only used on match days, at 1:55, but fans were kept there for 10 minutes, giving them less than an hour to get to the ground. The last coaches arrived with less than half an hour to go. Outside the fatal Leppings Lane end of the stadium, the number of fans began to build up.
There were thousands of people arriving with maybe 10, 15 minutes to spare to get into the ground. Obviously anxious to get in with their tickets.
By 2:30, police knew there was a major problem. By that time, there were between 3,000 and 4,000 people pushing towards the turnstiles. A metal gate buckled from the force of the crowd. Fans said they were packed so tightly around a police horse it was virtually lifted off the ground. And some supporters agreed with police. There was a real risk of deaths outside the ground. Then came the fateful decision to open the gate and let the fans in. Police wouldn't confirm reports that named the senior officer who gave the order. Although closed-circuit cameras allowed police to monitor the situation from directly above the Leppings Lane entrance, the fans were allowed to pour through the gate without supervision, turn to the right through a narrow opening and run on towards a tunnel through a door which on Saturday had been opened leading to the terraces. Stewards say they were forced to open the gate.
A policeman came up to him and asked him to open the gate, and he turned around and said, "No way am I opening them." So they come back with some more, and they said, "Our inspector said you've got to open them gates," and he took the keys out of his hand, and Mr. Cream, and asked him, "Don't open them doors, because if you open them, you're going to have death on your hands."
Minutes later, hundreds of people were being crushed. Those who escaped unharmed returned to their coaches.
There was just a numbness. It was just definitely numbness. The people downstairs, every time you looked through the interior mirror, you know, you could see them weeping and different things like that. Like, it was just then a general numbness throughout the whole coach.
Behind them at the Hillsborough Stadium, the first evidence to be presented to the public inquiry is now being assembled. Glenn O'Glaser, News at 10, Sheffield.
The Prince and Princess of Wales have visited the 40 people still being treated in 2 hospitals in Sheffield. One young fan told the royal couple how he was saved by another supporter who gave him the kiss of life. Ian McDermott said he'd never seen the man before and wants to thank him. 15 people are still in intensive care tonight.
Once again, the royal family find themselves offering comfort and encouragement to victims of a disaster. It's a role that's become all too familiar of late, but the Prince and Princess of Wales are aware of the lift it can bring to the injured. There are 44 victims still in hospitals in Sheffield, 16 in intensive care. The less seriously injured are suffering crush injuries, mainly broken ribs and limbs. They told the royal couple of what happened on the Hillsborough terraces, but there was also time for banter.
It's just where we didn't come yesterday. There wasn't room for bulkies on the bed, you know.
Earlier, the hospital visitors were the Liverpool team. They too came to boost the spirits of their fans, and England's John Barnes summed up the mood of the players.
It has killed the season. You know, football is now secondary to what can be done for the families of the dead and for the people here in the hospital. So, you know, as I said, really we have no idea what's going to happen as far as football goes, but that doesn't matter anyway.
Will it help coming to see those injured today?
We hope so. We hope so.
And what would your message be to Liverpool fans, John?
Well, it's difficult really because, you know, I think a lot of the fans would really still be thinking of in terms of the league and are we going to take part in the cup. But I think if not just Liverpool fans, if people could just rally around and help those in Liverpool, I think that's the only message we can give.
And a message for the families of the bereaved?
Well, it's early days yet, but I'm sure that things will be organised and we're going to go around and meet all the families and see what can be done. But, as you know, that is the main priority, the families of the bereaved and the injured. So that's all we can do, try and help them.
Do you think the FA Cup should carry on? Do you think there should be a final?
I haven't even thought about it, but I can't contemplate one with Liverpool being in it.
The team brought gifts of Liverpool memorabilia, and they also brought hope. One 20-year-old fan who'd been in a deep coma since Saturday was spoken to by the Liverpool manager, Kenny Dalglish, and he opened his eyes for the first time. Tonight, a consultant anaesthetist here, Dr. David Edbrook, said, "It was quite remarkable. It brought tears to my eyes." Mark Austin, News at 10, Sheffield.
Continued arriving, and among the many visitors here today was Liverpool supporter Mike Nelson. He suffered 3 cracked ribs and a bruised pelvis in Saturday's crush, but says he's one of the lucky ones. After being discharged from hospital and before setting off home for Liverpool, he came to pay his respects at the place where the tragedy began.
The inquests into the deaths of 48 victims of the disaster were formally opened in Sheffield today. The first inquests were those of 2 teenage sisters from Pinner in Middlesex. The coroner expressed his regret to all the deaths, and he said he was trying to understand the loss that families have suffered. The leading Liverpool lawyer, Sir Harry Livermore, who acts for many Heysel defendants, was there too. He said Liverpool is a heartbroken city. Clarence Mitchell reports.
The inquest at Sheffield's Medico-Legal Centre has been a solemn affair, attended by more reporters and cameramen than relatives. It had been thought many relatives would travel from Merseyside, but for the few who did decide to come, there was ample support. Sir Harry Livermore was there representing 6 families. He was asked what would be a fitting achievement for those families.
2 things. One, and not necessarily in this order. One, the question of compensation. And 2, that the public inquiry at the end of the day comes up with proposals which will prevent this sort of situation happening.
The inquest is being held simply to give evidence of identification of the victims to the Sheffield coroner, Dr. Stephen Popper. The procedure allows funeral arrangements to be organised. Nearly 50 cases are being dealt with today, each taking about 5 minutes. Dr. Popper said the speed was designed to minimise delay and unnecessary trauma for the victims' families. Before opening the hearing, the coroner made a statement. In that statement, Dr. Popper expressed his regret at the tragic deaths. He said he was trying to understand the terrible shock, loss and pain for the families involved. He went on to thank the police and the ambulance service for their work. He also thanked Sheffield's hospitals and those in the city who've individually counselled bereaved relatives. As the coroner finished, Sir Harry asked for the right to reply. Verging on the point of tears, Sir Harry said that Liverpool is a heartbroken city, upset, disturbed, sad and angry. Angry at what had happened, as well as the dreadful and totally insensitive remarks of the UEFA president. The tragedy, he said, would never be forgiven or forgotten. Before leaving, Sir Harry said Jacques Georges' remarks too would never be forgotten or forgiven, no matter how many times he apologised. The inquest is due to finish later this evening. It continues tomorrow.
The people of the two cities, united by the events at Hillsborough, were brought even closer today when their respective BBC local radio stations broadcast a shared programme on the tragedy. It was a chance for the people of Sheffield and Liverpool to share their grief, but as Jeremy Hibbard reports, there was also much bitterness.
Yeah. South Yorkshire.
Roger, thank you very much. I've got Frida Smith here, who's joining us on BBC Radio Sheffield. Frida, good morning.
Good morning.
What do you want to say, Frida?
Well, we've lived near the Wednesday ground for 45 years, and we have never, ever seen such a crowd outside the gates. Never.
This was a unique opportunity for the people of the two cities to talk to each other, to share their experiences and their grief.
Coming out, grown men sobbing their hearts out as they came from the ground.
As well as the sense of loss, some fans were clearly angry about the tragedy. Sheffield Wednesday chairman Bert McGee faced tough criticism over facilities at Hillsborough.
Come on, think about this, man. What football ground anywhere in the world carries 120 stretchers? Come on, be sensible.
What football ground in the world lets a disaster happen and everyone's dead who's going to die before the emergency services get on the scene?
Yeah, but I'd like to agree with Laddie. When you know there's going to be that many fans there, what's 100 stretchers to all them thousands of people?
53,000 people, and you can't supply oxygen bottles and defibrillators for people who've had a heart attack.
I think one thing we learned very early in the broadcast was that perhaps the hope that things would heal was premature. There's still an enormous amount of confusion, bewilderment and anger around, particularly in Merseyside. That came through very strongly. People in authority, the police, the football authorities, Mr McGee, the chairman of Sheffield Wednesday, this morning, have been heard to say, please don't probe for the cause, don't ask these questions yet, wait for the inquiry. But people who have been directly involved can't understand that. They have to have answers.
There were hundreds of calls to the two stations. Many, having offered to speak, found themselves too upset to do so and hung up. Others stayed on the line to talk about the way they'd been affected.
It was at Anfield recently, and their tannoy and communication system with the crowd was absolutely brilliant, he said.
I drove home to the Sunday night and feeling, although I wasn't physically hurt, feeling reasonably okay, and then sort of drove to work Monday morning, and without realising sort of what I was doing, I'd driven the car up the back of a lorry having just come off the motorway.
The switchboards never stopped ringing at either end, from what I gather. We had calls galore throughout the morning and into the afternoon, and I think people simply just wanted to say what had happened and what they felt about it. Tremendous fondness for each other across the two cities.
Money is continuing to flood into the Hillsborough Disaster Appeal. Since it was launched on Sunday, donations to the fund have been coming in from all over the country. Sheffield, Liverpool and Nottingham councils have each contributed £25,000. Another £100,000 has come from Ford's, Merseyside's largest employer. And now some of Liverpool's most famous names are banding together to make a fundraising record. Richard Ewart reports.
The man behind the new record is Jerry Marsden of Pacemakers fame. After the Bradford fire 4 years ago, he was responsible for a similar venture when a host of well-known singers got together to cut a new version of the Liverpool football anthem, You'll Never Walk Alone. The record went on to top the charts and raised thousands of pounds for the Bradford appeal. Now Jerry, together with other well-known Liverpool stars, including Paul McCartney and possibly the other surviving Beatles, is putting together a record for the Hillsborough appeal. This time it's a version of Ferry Cross the Mersey, a song Jerry says he wrote for the people of Liverpool. The new record will be produced by Stock, Aitken and Waterman, who've been behind a string of chart hits over the last few years, including a #1 version of the Beatles' Let It Be, made for the Zeebrugge Disaster Appeal. The 1989 version of Ferry Cross the Mersey is expected to be released early next week.
Tragedies like Hillsborough need not happen, according to Bradford University's Disaster Prevention Unit. It says the safety would be ensured if public places like sports grounds anticipated the worst and knew how to cope if it happened. It's a technique used by potentially lethal industries like chemical firms and coal mines, vital in stopping incidents escalating into disasters, Sue Crabtree reports.
The message the unit puts across is that disasters can be prevented. Nigel Grizzard, who helped found it, watched TV pictures of the Hillsborough chaos and said there appeared to be no emergency plans when the scale of the crush became obvious. Like anywhere people congregate, from shops to industry, the ground was a potential hazard. His unit, set up as a result of the Bradford City football fire, aims to identify risks and then plan to avoid them.
I think what you have to do is you have to bring in independent experts. You have to look very closely at all the possible scenarios and said what was the worst possible scenario that could possibly happen. Then looking at that, you could then turn around and say, we must change course of action. There are some things that we ought not to do. And if some things do happen, for example, the crush builds up, everyone who's there who's in an official capacity is trained for what to do.
What could you have done at Hillsborough?
You would have sat down and looked at the scenarios. Maybe one of the things would have been, as many people have said, to have moved the fans to the other areas of the ground. Another thing you may have said was, judging by the number of people coming, Hillsborough's the wrong ground, even though it's had a tradition of being used for semi-finals for many years recently. We believe that there is a way of preventing disasters happening. We can't prevent all disasters, but many of them are man-made, and we ought to try and prevent them. We've set ourselves that goal, and that's what we hope to do.
General Hospital, where many of those injured are still being treated. Later, he's expected to talk to more survivors at the Royal Hallamshire Hospital.
Mr. Kinnock in Sheffield. That's it for Look North today. We're back at the same time tomorrow night from Judith and me.
Decide whether to carry on with the FA Cup. As 250,000 mourn at Anfield, the club accuses the FA of insensitivity. The police say hundreds of fans at Hillsborough were drunk and could not be controlled. Good evening. The directors of Liverpool Football Club say they won't decide for another week whether the team will play on in the FA Cup. They've accused the Football Association of insensitivity in asking for a decision now. 250,000 fans have filed into the Anfield ground to mourn the dead of a disaster which the judge charged with heading the inquiry said today must never be allowed to happen again.
Liverpool's directors met in an attempt to reach the most sensitive decision in the history of the club. The fans' wishes would be respected, so would those of the players who'd previously indicated they'd be reluctant to take part in the semi-final. The chairman had been for the match, but after 3 hours the issue was deferred for a week. Hillsborough was too fresh in the memory.
We regret that we feel unable to make any decision as to the future of the FA Cup competition so close to these events, when there are supporters lying seriously ill in hospital and funerals to be arranged. We consider it to be insensitive for the Football Association to make this request so soon, and so placing us under additional pressure at a time of grief.
The Football Association responded by saying that they'd had some quick decisions to make. Liverpool, they argued, needed to know the FA's view before choosing whether to play or not.
If we have caused offence to those who've been bereaved, all I can say is I regret that very much indeed. I do hope that in time, and it may take some considerable time, but I do hope that in time they will come to understand that we want to do the right thing by them and by the people of Liverpool.
In a city still in shock, it's an issue which is turning some minds away from last Saturday and towards the future.
I think they should play it and give all the money to the bereaved parents, but it's obviously going to upset some people.
Really, it's just gone totally out of my heart now. We were going to go down to Wembley, and we've got season tickets, but now just can't be bothered.
Mrs. Anne Williams' son Kevin died at Hillsborough. He was 16.
I know how the players must feel, but I know if it was Kevin, He'd want them to play to get that cup. And I'd like to see them play to get the cup for Kevin and probably all the other mates that died.
Back at Anfield, a third full day of respect. The thick carpet of flowers in front of the Kop has grown by the hour. Someone left a tribute to the 95 dead, ingeniously displayed by arranging the seats in the stand. Liverpool's next match is almost certain to be a mile from here at Goodison Park against Everton a fortnight tomorrow. As a competitive match, it will be meaningless. As an occasion, it will be charged with emotion, as Merseyside commemorates its dead in the context of the sport that it loves.
Sheffield police officers claimed tonight that drunkenness amongst Liverpool fans was at least partly responsible for the disaster at Hillsborough. It's thought police evidence to the inquiry will say that drinking was a major factor in the crowd problems that led to the deaths. According to the Police Federation, a large number of Liverpool fans arrived at the ground late after drinking heavily, and the police couldn't control them.
Police left it up to individual pubs around Hillsborough to decide whether to open their doors on Saturday. Some did, others closed. Most landlords we've spoken to said the Liverpool fans they served were well behaved and left for the match in good time. But police on duty in streets near the ground have told their senior officers there were hundreds drinking heavily and still in pubs and off licences with less than half an hour to go to the kick-off. At this pub, there were 700 supporters who didn't leave until 10 to 3.
They drink yesterday a lot. Plus, they bought crates of beer, lager, you name it, what we got, they bought. And they drunk us dry.
It was all too apparent that police at the Leppings Lane end were having difficulty controlling the crowd. The senior officer who ordered the gate to be opened believed lives were in danger. Whatever the questions about that decision and tactics in general, the South Yorkshire Police want the Taylor inquiry to consider as well the behaviour of some of the fans they had to deal with.
We're talking about people who'd been drinking heavily, who were intent on getting in that ground before the match started, with only a very few minutes to spare, and they would not be controlled.
I think that drink was a factor in the tragedy that happened at Hillsborough. And indeed, yesterday I asked the Home Secretary if Lord Justice Taylor, who's doing the inquiry, would pay particular attention to that, and he said he would.
But tonight, questions about the policing of the match are still being asked.
Police who are policing a big game like a big pop concert or anything else expect that there will be perhaps some people who've taken drink, and I've no doubt there were some people who've taken drink, and I wouldn't like supporters to try and dodge any of their responsibilities in this area. But to claim that this is in some way a crucial issue, that a sudden influx of people coming from the pubs is a novelty at a football ground is, well, they must have been policing Noddyland up till now.
The South Yorkshire Police have reiterated their belief that they will eventually be vindicated by the Hillsborough inquiry.
The death toll at Hillsborough has risen to 95 after a 14-year-old boy died in Sheffield's Northern General Hospital. 10 fans are still in intensive care. Today, Lord Justice Taylor, who's conducting the public inquiry, visited the ground and said his job was to make sure such a tragedy never happened again.
Investigators were quickly down to business at the Hillsborough ground today, measuring the height and length of walls and barriers and studying the layout inside the stadium where the disaster occurred.
1, 2, 3, 4,
the loudspeaker system was tested at the north stand entrance where the fatal build-up began. Also touring the ground today on a preliminary inspection were the two men who head the separate government and police investigations. Lord Justice Taylor and the West Midlands Chief Constable, Mr. Geoffrey Deere, both said they'd come to Sheffield with completely open minds. But they brought with them a message for the bereaved families.
We have the same message that's been given by people all over the country of extreme sympathy and a resolution to see that this kind of thing doesn't happen again.
Some of the families were allowed into the stadium to lay flowers and spend a little time wandering near the goalmouth, behind which their relatives had crowded on Saturday. A surprise visitor to Sheffield this evening was Mr. Neil Kinnock. He went to the Northern General Hospital, where 10 patients are still being treated, but his aides described it as a private visit. This afternoon, the inquest into those who died was formally opened to hear evidence of identification. Liverpool lawyer Sir Harry Livermore, representing 6 bereaved families, told the coroner that remarks about the Liverpool fans by the president of UEFA had been dreadfully insensitive. He said that in Liverpool, a heartbroken city, the UEFA president would never be forgiven, no matter how often he apologised.
And today, the UEFA president, Monsieur Georges, admitted that some of the words he used about Liverpool fans after the disaster may have been more violent than he intended. He said he spoke before he'd really absorbed the situation, but he says he won't resign.
In the small mountain village of Saint-Maurice-sur-Moselle, near the Swiss border, the beleaguered UEFA president sought refuge behind the walls of his family firm of estate agents. Mr. Georges seemed genuinely distressed by the effect of what he said. He dismissed calls for his resignation, but admitted he'd chosen his words badly because of his feelings about the disaster.
C'est vrai que quand on voit ces images, eh bien, on n'est pas tout à fait soi-même. Vous savez, quand on souffre terriblement et quand vous avez une grande douleur, vous lancez un cri, eh bien, j'ai lancé un cri. Peut-être j'aurais dû lancer un cri moins fort, c'est vrai.
And for the people of Liverpool, Mr. Georges made an effort to send a message in English.
The bad mistake was done, and I will give all the people of Liverpool, sportsmen and others, all my sympathy, all my condolences for the poor family who has left one member in the drama of Sheffield.
Mr. Georges emphasised that last week he fought within UEFA for the readmission of English clubs to Europe. But neither that nor his apology may be enough to stop the calls for his resignation. Edward Sturton, BBC News, France.
Here, some football clubs have decided to pull down their perimeter fences. Workmen have already moved into Tottenham Hotspur's ground at White Hart Lane. 2 other London clubs have postponed midweek matches as a mark of respect to those who died.
At Tottenham Hotspur today, they cut down the fence that's caged in the fans for a decade. The wire mesh that used to be thought the simplest way to stop the hooligans, now regarded by many as a potential death trap, to be removed as quickly as possible.
They were put up in the first instance to stop hooliganism, and that is why they were predominantly put up in the late 70s, early 80s. And consequently, after Saturday, obviously, we've reviewed our situation, along with many other clubs probably.
Derby County have also pulled down their fencing, and some other clubs have made it clear they want to follow suit, including Liverpool themselves, though most will wait for the results of the Hillsborough inquiries. Arsenal and Queen's Park Rangers are among the few English First Division clubs who've never had fences. Their immediate reaction to the disaster has been to postpone midweek games tonight and tomorrow as a mark of respect for the dead, something the Football League president says should only be done by the Merseyside clubs.
We don't think it's appropriate. Life must go on, and those other clubs have already shown their respect for what's happened by their comments and by public announcements. We don't think it's necessary to suspend matches for that purpose.
But Queen's Park Rangers say they're ready to face the consequences.
Well, I'm afraid we just have to accept the situation. It's a fine or something or other, or we lose the points, but we just have to accept the decision. We have made our decision, and we think fit as a board of directors.
But tonight, the first English League games since the disaster did go ahead. The atmosphere at this evening's match between Watford and Walsall sombre and subdued as football tries to complete its season in dignity.
And now the rest.
The government takes another step back from soccer ID cards. Some police say fans attacked them while they were saving lives. Mrs. Thatcher will go to Moscow before the Queen. Adnan Khashoggi, the Marcus's favourite financier, is arrested. And the favourite of the over-50s is back in town. Good evening. The government gave its strongest indication today that the Football Spectators Bill, with the crucial clause on the introduction of identification cards, will be postponed until after the inquiry into the Hillsborough disaster. There's strong opposition to the bill among MPs of all parties. The Leader of the House, Mr John Wakeham, said it would be seemly to delay the bill. The Hillsborough inquiry will look into the question of a national membership scheme.
It was the Leader of the House, John Wakeham, who gave the clearest indication yet that the bill, which in Part 1 makes every football fan in England and Wales carry an ID card, may well be delayed. MPs on all sides of the House have already expressed their worries about the scheme causing dangerous crowd build-ups, but today Mr Wakeham said its eventual introduction would need to take into account the new Hillsborough inquiry.
The bill is an enabling framework. The government was already given a full commitment not to implement the membership scheme within that framework until arrangements have satisfactorily been worked out. That commitment still stands and obviously now embraces the lessons to be learned from this tragic event.
Yesterday, Home Secretary Douglas Hurd talked about a short delay in the bill's progress, quote, for the sake of seemliness. But today the government gave no date for its resumption through the Lords or for its arrival in the Commons. And what had MPs made of that?
Well, I think a definite softening of line. The determination to go ahead was not there. And I believe that there's a lot of discussion going on now. And my guess is that the government are actually going to postpone further consideration, at least of Part 1 of the bill.
So the message has gone out to ministers, and especially to Mrs Thatcher, from the likes of John Carlisle, who until now has been an ardent supporter of the bill, that unless it contains the findings of the Taylor inquiry, albeit the preliminary findings, then it won't succeed in the House of Commons. Hence the delay over the timing of the bill, though we are told that Mrs Thatcher remains as firmly committed as ever to its principles. Michael Brunson, News at 10, Westminster.
A Sheffield MP, Mr Irvin Patnick, says many police officers who were at Hillsborough have told him they were kicked, punched and urinated on by Liverpool fans as they tried to help victims of the disaster. One senior officer said, to paint all the Liverpool fans lily white is wrong. The judge who will head the inquiry into the Hillsborough disaster, Lord Justice Taylor, visited the ground today. He says he's determined to make sure such a tragedy never happens again.
Friends of those who died in last Saturday's disaster returned to Hillsborough today to see for themselves the place where their loved ones died. Many of them had been on the same terrace on Saturday. They huddled together in small, despairing groups, hoping that the act of sharing their grief might bring some momentary comfort. Lord Justice Taylor, who will chair the public inquiry, also came to inspect the terrace. With him, West Midlands Chief Constable Geoffrey Deere, who will gather the police evidence. They paused to study the small gate in the perimeter fence, which had proved so inadequate an escape route. The judge was clearly affected by what he'd seen.
It's deeply moving, and it makes clear the need to see that this never happens again.
Even as the judge formed his impressions, safety experts were collecting evidence for his inquiry. One of the key questions he'll address, allegations by the Police Federation of mob violence by some Liverpool fans.
Well, they arrived very late, only a few minutes before the game was due to start. They'd been drinking very heavily. They wouldn't accept what police officers were trying to tell them. They wouldn't accept any direction at all. They were hell-bent on getting in there, and that's what they were going to do. Now, there is an estimation that quite a lot of them, 500 plus, were there, amongst them, without any tickets, and they meant getting in there. And they were pushing and crushing, and very, very strong, and the police officers there were virtually overwhelmed and couldn't hold them back.
A local MP is supporting those allegations of...
I can actually say is, I was speaking to these officers. They were tired, they were devastated. They said that they had been trying to save lives, that they'd been attacked by some of the fans, they'd been kicked and punched even when they were giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and people were urinating on them from the balcony above where they were working.
Some of the bereaved families were in court this afternoon to hear the Sheffield coroner formally open and adjourn his inquest. This Liverpool fan was one of the lucky ones. Just released from hospital, he came to pay his respects. The Archbishop of York came too, to lend his spiritual support.
I think it's important when somebody has suffered a bereavement that they should come and see where it happened, and this is one step in coming to terms with it. There is a much longer process which they're going to have to go through, and there's a much longer process which the people in Sheffield are going to have to go through.
Glenn O'Glaser, News at 10, Sheffield.
Here too at Anfield, tens of thousands of people are finding solace, if not answers, in their sad pilgrimage to the ground. For families like the Tootles and the Glovers, who each lost a teenage son, the trip's an important step in coming to terms with their children's sudden death. The Kop, which has so often in the past echoed to the roars of the crowd, is now cocooned in a dignified silence. The goalposts have disappeared beneath a sea of scarves, and a carpet of flowers has been left by around 250,000 visitors. And with memories of last Saturday so fresh, accusations that some Liverpool fans misbehaved have brought an angry retort. Paul Kelly was at the match and wants proof of the allegations.
It seems to me that bit by bit there's pieces getting put into the jigsaw to try and deflect a little bit of the blame from the persons or person who are going to carry the ultimate blame.
My friends in the Merseyside police are telling me that someone's going to try this on, and we should make the public aware that they're not to get away with it. It's a slur on good police officers, and this Tory MP is behaving disgracefully.
Special telephone counselling services have taken hundreds of calls, some bitterly critical of ticket allocation at Hillsborough, others complaining about police behaviour. Some of the survivors have begun legal action.
The police were liable, and the Sheffield Wednesday club was liable, and there's no doubt in my mind that there was negligence here on the part of at least one organisation, if not more, and in the end of the day, compensation should be paid to those who have suffered.
But as these families laid a wreath, their only thoughts were for their two dead children. Mark Webster, News at 10, Anfield.
Liverpool Football Club has said the Football Association was insensitive in asking it whether it wanted to replay its semi-final tie so soon after Hillsborough. The club said it didn't want to decide about a rematch yet. The FA accepted that, and a final decision will be made next Tuesday.
The directors wanted to make a decision the fans would want, but they're divided. The huge queue outside bore witness that the city is more concerned with remembering than the next game of football. The chairman felt the FA had pushed them into a premature and insensitive decision.
We regret that we feel unable to make any decision as to the future of the FA Cup competition so close to these events, when there are supporters lying seriously ill in hospital and funerals to be arranged. We consider it to be insensitive of the Football Association to make this request so soon, and so placing us under additional pressure at a time of grief.
The FA was repentant.
I'm deeply sorry if that's the case, but we must go ahead and make those plans at some stage and hope that they will come to fruition. If we're unable to carry it through, we shall understand, and there will be a blank line in the record books for the FA Challenge Cup 1989.
The club want to know what the families of the dead want. Generally, the city is deeply divided, but this family that lost a son is quite sure.
Peter idolised Liverpool. He went to his first match when he was 2 years of age. His dad took him. And he lived for them. And as far as I'm concerned, he died for them. And that's my reason. And he would have wanted it to go on. If Peter was here now, he'd say, yeah, he should play.
The feeling here is that Liverpool will eventually decide to take part in the latter stages of the Cup as a memorial to those who died. For the moment, though, everyone at the club, and that particularly includes the manager, Kenny Dalglish, and the players, want to do all they can to try and help the injured and the bereaved. Giles Smith, News at 10, Anfield.
The government's wish to have everyone seated at football grounds will threaten the financial survival of many clubs in the English League. All but a handful already lose thousands of pounds a year, and big ground improvements will prove beyond their means.
In the last 48 hours, there have been demands for football spectators to be given something better. New, out-of-town, all-seater stadia to replace antiquated facilities. But football by itself can't afford it. It's been argued that football's a community asset which should be backed by local government, as it is in France and Germany. This view is endorsed by Alex Finn of the advertising giant Saatchi & Saatchi, who advises Tottenham and Arsenal on marketing.
This is too easy and a glib answer to say to move to new stadia. This is not the panacea. The answer lies in establishing closer links with the community. The local authorities will help because if they recognise that football is as important to them as maybe the provision of transport or even library services.
English League football is only just breaking even. £85 million a year comes from supporters going through the turnstiles. Sponsorship from Barclays Bank and individual companies provides £25 million. Television income is now £11 million. Commercial activities like perimeter advertising brings in £10 million, and the pools companies provide another £4 million, a total annual income of £135 million. The club's main expenditure is on wages for players and officials, £90 million. Ground maintenance and development takes up £35 million. Policing costs £5 million, and interest on loans and overdrafts another £5 million, a total of £135 million, leaving nothing extra for ground development. One third division club, Southend United, is trying to make progress on its own. Southend plays at Roots Hall. On a typical midweek fixture like tonight's against Brentford, the club expects a gate of 4,500, just enough to break even. In a season, Southend will take £300,000 in gate money. Sponsors provide another £200,000. Marketing and pools and TV income generate another £200,000. That gives annual income of £700,000. Wages and costs are £650,000. After other expenses, the club makes a loss of £50,000 a year. But Southend's chairman, Vic Jobson, has ambitious plans for a new £12 million stadium. The project is possible because of the involvement of a local building company which will develop housing at Roots Hall.
We've got to get people involved who can commercially gain or get a benefit out of our national game. And we've got to give them something in return for what they're doing. And we've got to join together and make our game safe, commercially. We're trying to do it here.
Southend haven't yet got planning permission for a new stadium, emphasising the importance of local authorities in developing new grounds. Clubs like Southend United, which have done deals with retail or property companies, will be able to afford to move to new grounds. Others will find it very difficult paying for new safety provisions. Hugh Pym, News at 10, Southend United.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Nicholas Witchell and Anna Ford.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. The Prime Minister has said the government will go ahead with the bill to make identity cards compulsory at football matches because, she said, this country has the worst soccer safety record in the developed world. But Neil Kinnock accused Mrs Thatcher of putting the safety of others second to her own pride. Liverpool Football Club has announced the end of the COP. Anfield will become an all-seater stadium. The Transport Workers' Union is going ahead with a ballot on a national dock strike. The London crossbow killing, a murder charge has been dropped for lack of evidence. Also tonight, the rise of the right in Germany, 100 years after the birth of Adolf Hitler. And is it correct to smack your child? A new campaign has said it should be made illegal. The government is pressing ahead with its Football Spectators Bill, the bill which will make it possible to introduce soccer identity cards, but it is going to delay it by a few months, a concession which ministers hope will satisfy the anger on their own backbenches. In the Commons this afternoon, it was clear that, notwithstanding the delay, the Prime Minister is as determined as ever that the bill should become law by the end of this parliamentary session. To do otherwise, she said, would be negligent. But Mr Kinnock, in one of the angriest exchanges between them in recent months, said that to continue with the bill in present circumstances was against what he called common sense and common decency and would undermine the Hillsborough inquiry.
As Downing Street was bombarded with reports of increasing alarm on the backbenches, key ministers were summoned to a special meeting with the Prime Minister before today's Cabinet meeting. The discussion continued after the Cabinet, more than 2 hours in all spent assessing the threat. Downing Street let it be known that the Prime Minister would relaunch the government's case, which she duly did when Mr Kinnock accused her of letting her vanity cloud her judgment.
Members on both sides of this House and people throughout the country will regard her decision to force through her identity card scheme to be an offence against common sense and an offence against common decency. Will the Right Honourable Lady tell us, how can she, in the aftermath of that terrible tragedy last Saturday, put the safety of others second to her own pride?
To refuse to pass the bill this session
to deal with problems already identified, and then to leave ourselves with no vehicle by which to respond immediately to the lessons from Hillsborough, including an all-seating stadium, would be a very grave decision for this House.
Mr Kinnock got increasingly angry as the Prime Minister didn't seem to budge an inch. But it's now becoming clear that the government has given some ground. They were insisting even yesterday that the whole bill would be pushed through by July. But ministers are saying this evening that the bill won't now complete its common stages until October, in the hope that MPs will by then have found enough time to consider the inquiry's findings. The reaction from those backbenchers who'd been demanding a longer delay has been mixed.
I'm certainly happier than I was. The rigidity of timing has now gone, and we've been told that we can go right through until November with the bill. The bill is obviously now going to be far more flexible, that some of Taylor's recommendations, if they are ready, can be included in the bill.
I think what has come out this afternoon is very bad advice for the Prime Minister. And I think that what the House of Commons was looking for this afternoon was some clear indication that we would have an all-embracing probe into the problems of ground safety at all major spectator sports.
We've set up the inquiry under Lord Justice Taylor. We've asked him if he has any suggestions which might require putting into effect through legislation that are relevant to this bill, that we should have them in good time so that they can be incorporated in the bill, and that means that we can delay the bill till the completion of the bill till the end of the parliamentary session.
The government is now hoping it's done enough to avoid what was beginning to look like a major revolt. But it will be concerned that there appears to be a considerable number of backbenchers who are still unhappy that the bill is proceeding in its current form.
Football administrators and supporters organisations found it hard to believe that the government intended to go ahead with the identity card scheme. They're afraid it will lead to longer delays and more trouble at turnstiles.
It's taken place in Liverpool. Gary Church, who was 19, had given up his seat to stand on the terraces with his friends.
The Liverpool anthem, You'll Never Walk Alone, specially requested by the family of 19-year-old Gary Church, the season ticket holder who had travelled to Sheffield on Saturday hoping to see his heroes win their way to Wembley, only to die in the crush at the Leppings Lane end. Following the coffin into the packed church were some of the footballers Gary followed week by week, together with Liverpool manager Kenny Dalglish and other club officials. One of the players, John Aldridge, read the second lesson. The vicar, the Reverend Ray Hutchinson, spoke of the sympathy and caring of the community for the bereaved, spoilt, he said, by the rows over the last few days about what happened on Saturday.
But that message of caring and a wanting to share your burden of grief has been sadly marred by the insensitive, distasteful, and very badly timed remarks which have been reported coming from various quarters, and some also distasteful reporting by some of the media.
Gary Church's funeral is the first of many to be held over the next few days, days in which the city of Liverpool will grieve as few cities have grieved before.
British football's most famous terrace, the Kop at Anfield, the home of the Liverpool club, is to be converted into a seated area. Liverpool have not given a date, but they hope to do it as soon as possible. They've also said the fencing at Anfield will come down.
The most famous football terracing in the world, first constructed in 1906, has been the visible expression of the fans' intense feelings for their club and for the game itself. In the 60s, with standing room for 30,000, it held almost half of Anfield's capacity. It's been regarded as the most knowledgeable, passionate and humorous collection of supporters in the country, with its unique Mersey sound. But from an Anfield still over, are to be installed on the Kop, thus reducing the stadium's capacity to below 40,000. The club's chief executive, Peter Robinson, said it is our intention to move to an all-seater stadium as soon as possible. Inevitably, the Copites, as they're known, have mixed reactions.
It might be a bit safer, like, but everyone's been used to the Cop bystands enough.
I don't think it'll change much, because, like, it's just going to be seats in it.
It'll never be the same.
Won't be the same
atmosphere as it used to be, because the memory of the people in here, like, linger in the air, and I think there'll be a respect to that in the atmosphere.
Tommy Smith was a Liverpool player for 16 years. He thinks the club has made the right decision.
I haven't been there on Saturday. I'm not sorry at all. I do understand that it's a bit of an institution and people will miss it. But after Saturday, and nowhere where people have got to be crowded into a space like that, again, should be allowed at football grounds, you know.
It's also been revealed today that after a 5-hour meeting, the club has changed its mind about the barriers. They are to come down, both here and at Everton, before either ground is next used. At Liverpool, the all-seater plan is part of a £6 million scheme. Admission prices here on the Kop will inevitably rise with the installation of seats. It's cost £3.50 to stand here this season. It'll be at least £5 to sit. Liverpool are conscious that they should not price football beyond the pocket of the working man. Generations of families have stood in the same place on the Kop over the years. They may still come to watch their team, but things will never be the same.
The Judith Stamper.
Tonight, a court rules that a Yorkshire baby should be allowed to die naturally.
Leeds market traders celebrate as a plan to redevelop Kirgate Market is blocked.
Taking new steps, the South Yorkshire youngsters on their way to Russia.
That's right. Car you wanted, was it?
A word, really, with the boss. My name's Griffiths, Megan Griffiths. There are just the three...
A long time to heal, but there is one certainty. Everyone is determined to make sure such a tragedy never happens again. So what does the future hold after Hillsborough?
Later in the programme, I'll be discussing what that future might be with a panel of guests. They come from both sides of the Pennines, from Sheffield and Liverpool, the cities deeply affected by the disaster. From another city offering help born out of a similar experience. From the world of football, the fans who love the game. Those who play it. Those responsible for crowd safety. Those who also want to build a safer future with other sports. And those who understand why fans behave as they do. There'll also be an opportunity for you to have your say. You'll be able to take part in a phone-in programme about Hillsborough on your BBC local radio station. We'll be giving you the numbers to call at the end of our discussion here in the studio.
For the past week, all our thoughts have been dominated by Hillsborough. The government has launched an inquiry into what happened last Saturday, but away from the controversial issue of who was to blame, attention has naturally focused on the cities of Liverpool and Sheffield. Nearly a week after Hillsborough, the sense of shock and grief in those two communities is still overwhelming.
As the enormity of the tragedy which had struck Liverpool began to dawn on a still Sunday morning, there was only one place to turn. Just as those who died were bound by their love of Liverpool Football Club, so the bereaved, bemused and bewildered people of Merseyside now found new strength in the shadow of the world-famous Kop. Initially, it could only be a time for grieving. No one sought justification for the horrific events, only solace and understanding. It was that will to comprehend why this tough community had once again been singled out for suffering that led thousands of Liverpudlians to another of the city's landmarks, just 24 hours after the carnage of Hillsborough.
Tonight, we come here to pray. We come to mourn, to offer sympathy, and to prepare ourselves as a city to help and care for the bereaved and the injured, to be, as it were, a civic family.
They say if Liverpool's heart is with football, its soul belongs to the church. And perhaps it was inevitable that the two images should become intrinsically entwined. The pilgrimage to Anfield has continued all week. Thousands of people have now left their own mark of respect to the dead. Some are deeply personal, others speaking for a community united in loss. Together they've turned the home of their footballing heroes into a fitting shrine. A memorial that may give strength to the families and friends that must bury their dead during the coming days.
All of us feel utter devastation. The whole city and the city of Liverpool, all who love football, all are involved. Not for the first time, a sunny afternoon with the exciting prospect of a close match has suddenly been transformed into carnage.
When the enormity of the tragedy is as great as at Hillsborough, the church tries to express in word and hymn the feelings of the people. In Liverpool this week and here in Sheffield, the hymn was the same in both grieving cities. For the survivors at the Sheffield hospitals, there were visits from relatives, friends and the royal family, from the Lord Mayor of Sheffield and from the Liverpool team. For those who had died, the tributes came from all over the world. By today, 7,000 had signed the remembrance book at the town hall. They had donated thousands of pounds to the disaster appeal. All week, the greatest outpouring of grief has been at the scene of the tragedy, the Hillsborough ground itself.
I'm not coming back. That's it. Finished. No way. That's my final. The flowers are finished. I'm never going back.
Many relatives and friends have made the pilgrimage from Merseyside. Here, the people of Sheffield and Liverpool have been together, joined in mourning.
From Jake Fowler in Sheffield and Juliet Bremner in Liverpool. Another community which has experienced tragedy in recent years is Bradford, my hometown. The fire at the Bradford City Football Ground in 1985 claimed the lives of 56 people. Following that disaster, survivors and the relatives of those who died had to face up to life without their loved ones. This week, some of them have been to Liverpool and Sheffield. Other people who became involved in helping the victims of Bradford have also been comforting those affected by Hillsborough. They've been able to pass on some of the lessons learned during the past 4 years. Peter Pitt reports.
The tributes this week at Hillsborough formed an image powerfully reminiscent for the people of Bradford, a reminder of their football fans who died in the fire at Valley Parade. The message from Bradford to the people of Sheffield and Merseyside is that the traumas still continue. A year after the fire, at the unveiling of a memorial, many of the survivors had barely begun to come to terms with their grief. Now, 4 years on, they're still travelling the long road to full recovery. Duncan Firth's wife died from burns suffered in the Bradford fire.
Cast upon the waters of the River Mersey. Footballing scarves covered every available inch of barrier on the Kop, and still they were being added to displays around the ground this afternoon. Just before 7 o'clock, those who were still waiting to get into Anfield filed into the stands. Many of the Liverpool players walked out onto the pitch, amongst them John Barnes, who's pulled out of the England squad for this week's game against Albania. And a short service was held to mark the end of the week of mourning. crowds finally gone, the gates of Anfield were closed, the public expression of grief at an end. Privately, Liverpool will never forget the Hillsborough '95.
In Sheffield, where the disaster happened, a memorial service has been held at the Anglican Cathedral. Several thousand people of all denominations heard the Archbishop of York urge them not to look for a scapegoat.